Welcome back to my Commodore 64 Memories videos. This is where I look at old Commodore 64 software and some of the technical details behind them. Today we have Ikari Warriors, published in 1988 by Elite. The coder was John Twiddy, graphics by John Harrison, Karen Truman, Paul Walker and Rory Green. The music was by Jason Brook and Mark Cooksey. I remember getting this way back in the day on tape, and it was a really fantastic conversion. Technically very accomplished, and I'm going to have a little look today at some of the technical aspects. We're going to look at the disk version, I think. Here we are, as usual, back in C64 Debug GUI, just loading up the disk image here. This is the original disk image, and what we get is, Graham Ashton loader, sometimes called the bleep load, because it makes bleep noises, I guess. I did a whole video about this loader, or this range of loaders, because this code, or variations of it, or close variations, has been used in a lot of games. So I'll put a link to that in the video description below. We've got this rather lovely little loading screen going on with the colour border effect for the loader in the background there. More bleeping. Little bit of... There we go. So we've got this rather nice little sprite airplane and character screen background scrolling around. Nice little game intro for this. This game is really well polished. I really do like this game. So we've got the Ikari Warriors logo coming in and this rather nice little bouncing background picture. Then some credits text. And then it cycles through the game backgrounds. And of course we've got the top and bottom borders open with the sprites up in the top and bottom borders. The red bounding boxes indicate where the sprites are. If I put the targeting cursor in the screen, we can see that it's surprisingly a single buffered text screen. So I'm guessing that there's quite a lot of dynamic character set swapping around going on as it swaps between the data for the character set rather than the character set is at the stationary address of 4800 in hex and the screen is at 4000, 4000 if you like, in hex. We can see that there's a little bit of raster timed effect there, so that because both borders are open, the top of the screen needs to be hidden, probably by an invalid bitmap mode, where the bit chip just displays black. The memory window view shows that there's quite a lot of memory access going on, for the read access going on in the beginning of memory. Look at 400 and roughly 800 or something like that in hex, I think, maybe 1000 in hex. So there's an awful lot of reading going on, there's an awful lot of writing going on, but that's into the screen bank, and also the writing also occurs later on in the colour memory as well. But it's surprising, right? The character set is not changing, the screen pointer is not changing, even though the screen's scrolling around nice and quickly. It's not an FLD effect. And I've done a video on the FLD effect before, but it's not that, because we can see that the whole screen is filled with valid lines. So yeah, it really is just, wow, that's a lot of decompression by the looks of it. Yeah, so yes, the whole screen scrolling is just basically scrolling a single buffered screen. It's probably chasing the raster going down the screen, isn't it? And it's also updating colour memory as well. So there's an intriguing thing about this game, is that the game screen is a little bit narrower than usual, but it's hidden quite well because the sprites in the border for the top and bottom score and status display is also narrower, so it's not really that noticeable that the game screen is narrower than normal. So here we are in the game. We've got a load of sprites, right? I mean, the multiplexer in this game is actually really quite good, right? It's really quite strong, considering when this game was made. Oh, look, surprisingly, when I shoot, or when the enemies shoot, the bullets, the white bullets, are not sprites because there's no red bounding box. So that means the bullets are software sprites, in other words, characters. But we're not getting the usual bounding box, are we, for the sprites? So it's probably updating the characters dynamically. It's interesting to note as well, look, if I move my player character around, the player character mostly correctly sorts with respect to the priority of the other sprites around it as well. So that makes this quite an intriguing multiplexer. I think maybe we'll have a look at this with a trained version of the game so that we can maybe enable invulnerability to investigate that a little bit more. Because if I keep on dying, it's going to be quite difficult to find out how strong this multiplexer is, right? But moving the targeting cursor up and down. Well, let's get some enemies on the screen. There we go. There's an... Oh, okay. I just died again. Okay, let's move up. Well, okay. So there aren't any enemies on the screen. I need to scroll around a bit so that there are enemies on the screen. So let's unpause the game again in the emulator. And we will move up the screen a bit until we get a load of enemies on the screen. And then I'm going to try and pause it at the right position. That's enough enemies, right? So let's pause it there. Go back to the Vic debug view. Now, if I move the targeting cursor up and down, you can see, by looking at where the red bounding boxes are, when the sprites get updated. Now, that's really interesting. The sprites are being updated in the middle of the screen. So here, up at the top, that's where the split is, and that's where it starts introducing the sprite definitions, right? But then if I move the targeting cursor down, you can see that instead of updating the sprites as early as possible below the sprite, it's updating it as late as possible just before the sprites are needed. So at that raster line there, 2 raster lines, maybe 3 raster lines above where the bottom set of sprites is needed, it does the necessary updates in the VIC chip to display the new sprites. So this is an unusual multiplexer, in that this multiplexer updates as late as possible rather than as early as possible. When I say as early as possible, it means just underneath when the sprite or when the sprites have been finishing their render, right? So I've done a whole video series on how to write a sprite multiplexer, so I've gone in this in more detail, so I'll try and remember to put a link to that in the video description below. But this multiplexer definitely updates the sprites as late as possible, just above. Look, so just above the blue person there, the next blue person on the left is then updated. Look, there we go. Doink! That blue person on the left is updated just before it's needed. Wow. So yes, this means that you really need to make sure that your raster timing and your sprite update timing is timed very accurately, because there's no leeway, or there's very little leeway. You only have a few raster lines to update the sprites before it starts displaying. So that's really unusual, because it's usually more efficient to update, say, sprite 0 just after sprite 0 has finished displaying. So you would normally sort the sprites from top to bottom, because the raster beam goes from top to bottom on the screen, right? And then you have sprite 0 up near the top, sprite 1 just underneath sprite 0, for example, and then you would progress down the screen, and then just as sprite 0 finishes rendering, you would then have a raster interrupt that comes along and then updates sprite 0 again. But yeah, look, up at the top of the screen where the screen split is, it's basically got a completely unrolled speed code update. There's no indexed registers, there's no indirected register lookups. It's just doing load store, load store, load store, load store, which is the most efficient way in terms of speed to update all of the pointers. And then the last thing it does at that position there, just below that position there, it's updating the sprite frame pointers, which tells the chip which sprite frame to display. So at or above this position, the sprite frame pointers are at 5000, look, and all of those sprite frame pointers are displaying an empty sprite, or a black sprite, but it's probably empty. And then here it's just updating all of the sprite frame pointers, and then right at the end of the raster line schedule, the VIC chip starts reading those sprite frame pointers, and then it populates the sprites data for the next raster line, and it does that roughly as the border starts. Might be a few cycles in, but basically the VIC chip, because the sprites are enabled, is using a few cycles to fetch sprite data from memory, and it's refreshing that from the sprite data pointers. So it's interesting to note that we have 8 sprites being used up at the top of the screen. There we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, yep. So the blue person sprite is the last one being used for the top of the screen sprite. And then if I move the targeting cursor down, there we go, the next bunch of sprites then come along. So yeah, it really is. It's updating as late as possible, rather than as early as possible. As early as possible would be basically from top to bottom, it would basically be almost at the top of the screen, right? So yeah, an intriguing way of doing this sprite multiplexer. It seems like, when I look at this, it seems like to get the priority of the player correct with the sprites, it seems like there's a little bit of gap detection maybe. So there seems to be a good gap, right, between the tanks and the blue people just underneath the tanks. And there's, what, like 30 pixels of gap there, roughly, between the tanks and the top row of blue people, right? There's a row of 30 pixels, so that gives a good time to reuse the sprites. And then we got the next bunch of sprites down at the bottom of the screen, and then the last line there is where the sprite data is updated to switch off the sprites as well. So the invalid bitmap mode comes along, and you can see invalid bitmap 2 being used in the display mode when it gets to that raster split there. So the display mode shows invalid bitmap 2 mode in the C64 debug GUI. But to switch off the sprites are then being changed to be sprite pointer, sprite frame rather, 40 in decimal, no, hex, sorry. And that basically turns off the sprites because it uses sprite data at 5000 in hex, which is empty sprite. So what I do like about this game is that it has really pretty good, really well-timed, stable splits for the top and bottom of the screen to hide all of the scrolling character data, right? Because both the top and bottom borders are open. But yeah, I really am surprised at this multiplexer doing the update as late as possible, just before the new sprites are needed, look. So there we go, the new sprites for this bottom area come on. But yeah, I think there's a useful gap between the tanks and the blue people, and that useful gap allows the next chunk of sprites to be rendered from top to bottom, and allows the player priority with respect to the sprites around it to be mostly stable. All right, so I think this game makes pretty good use of having these gaps in the game, especially because the bullets are not sprites. The bullets are characters, dynamic characters at that. And so you don't need to worry about bullet sprites traversing this area between the gaps, where you want to have gaps so that you can have a nice stable sort of the player with respect to the rest of the sprites around it. So I did do a little video as well about having stable ordering with these kinds of games, right, in sprite multiplexers, and I actually added that functionality to my sprite multiplexer. So I'm happy to see a similar methodology of using stable sprite ordering in multiplexers there, so that we get a good depth perception, right? It's no good if the background sprites are flicking in front of the player sprite or vice versa, right? When the perspective is wrong or would be wrong. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail, but with a trained version. So here we are in the trained version, so that the player won't die when coming into contact with the enemy sprite. And you can see as the player is below the enemy sprites, the player is pretty much consistently sorted correctly. Apart from there, the player's feet popped in front of the yellow enemy there just for a couple of frames, but generally speaking, when there's quite a lot of sprites on the screen still, the sprite multiplexer seems to consistently sort. Anyway, so let's open up the character set view, and we can see there quite clearly that when bullets are fired, we've got dynamic characters being updated so that the white bullet frames, if you like, are superimposed over the top of the characters which they are moving over, and then those characters are dynamically updated there in the character set. You can see them flickering around as I fire, as the enemies fire, and I'm not dying because it's a trained version of the game. You can see how the character set information from the tiles behind, or the characters behind the bullets, are being copied in there and then displayed on the screen. So that's a really good way of doing it, right? I really like that in terms of this game. It's a really powerful way of using what we call software sprites, where the sprites are updated by the CPU rather than hardware, to add extra graphical information to the game without using our precious hardware sprite resources. Again, here you can see how good this multiplexer is, because even though there's quite a lot of enemies on the screen, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, is it? The player sprite is pretty much still consistently sorting in terms of whether or not it's in front or behind of objects as I move the player sprite around. So yeah, it's really important in this type of game, I think, right? It means that you get a much better sense of depth, and you have a much better game display to look at, right? If your player character is consistently sorting and has consistent priority. Some games, because their sprite multiplexer wasn't engineered with this in mind, some games just, like, really don't care. And I think that it's not so great doing that, if you don't care about the visual aspect of your game. Whereas it's, you can make a strong multiplexer and have consistent sprite sorting with regards to the apparent depth of objects, right? This game does it, my multiplexer does it, for example. But yeah, I really do like the way that this game merges its character-based bullets with the sprite-based effects for the rest of the enemies, and also I think the grenades and stuff like that, right? There we go, there's the grenade sprites. But the explosions for the grenades, right, are character-based. I mean, there's a puff of smoke where the grenade itself disappears, but the expanding explosion effect are characters. It updates the characters on the screen. So if I fire a grenade, or if I shoot a shell from the tank in a minute, you'll see the nice character-based explosion effect. If I walk onto a landmine, there we go, there's the character-based explosion effect. So it uses a nice, well, basically animated character blocks, right? And also dynamically animated characters for the bullets as well from this enemy. So that means that the static enemies and also the running around enemies reuse the same kind of like bullet code. And, you know, why not? It's a very good routine. With this static enemy shooting 3 bullets at a time, and me shooting bullets as well, you can see how many dynamic characters are filled up there at the end of the character set information. It's what, like 12, 16 characters perhaps that get filled in. There we go, more character-based explosion effects. So I think this game makes really good use of character-based effects and also sprite-based effects. That's what I really liked about this game as well. I like the way that you can pop into the tanks as well and move them around. Of course, I've got invulnerability on, and I'm cheating so that the game seems to be a lot easier. But yeah, I really like the way that you can move in, hop into different vehicles and move them around. The landmines were always a little bit of a pain. I remember that in the original arcade as well. You had to learn where they were. But yeah, this game really does make very good use of colour, very good use of its nice strong multiplexer. And then at the end of the game, we have this really quite large block of sprites, 2x4 block of sprites. And this is the person you're meant to be trying to rescue at the end of the game. I think this person must be a giant or something, because I don't think that they need rescuing themselves, right? We can see those nice character-based explosion effects as well. But yeah, this is basically the end of the game. Congratulations, you have rescued Colonel Cook and received lots of extra points. And then it's game over. And then you just get to enter your name into the high score table. But a really nice polished transition between the game and then the high score entry as well. I really do like the way that this game screen kind of like bounces up and down between these transitions. Let's look at the character set debug view here during the intro and the title screen sequence. And you can see how often the character set data, not the character set pointer, is being swapped around. So there's new data being copied in when this screen comes in. It's not a bitmap, it's a character-based screen. And then this is a character-based screen as well, so there's new text being copied in, and then there's the whole background information as well, and that gets copied in, or parts of the data gets copied in. But look, you can see how often it swaps around, that we get this new information here, a lot of new information there. Don't forget, in the memory view, right, there was a lot of memory access going on between the transitions for these screens. So yeah, there was quite a lot of decompression or something like that going on in the background. Let's look at this in ICU 64 now, so that we can see the character set changes in a little bit more detail. See if we get any dynamic sprites updates going on. So look at the text screen's graphics map debug view there. We can see that this game screen is actually missing, what is it, 4 characters from the left and 4 characters from the right. So that's 8 characters in total, which means that it's 40 minus 8, 32. So it's 32 characters wide rather than 40 characters wide. There are 2 characters up at the top of the screen and maybe a character down at the bottom of the screen also not being updated. So the game screen is actually a little bit smaller than you would normally expect, right? And I think that's probably a function of the graphics aspect ratio of the original arcade as well. But also, I think it probably saves a few cycles of game frame time there. And with updating the color RAM and also the screen RAM in a single buffer mode and chasing the raster down screen, I think that probably almost certainly helps with the CPU time, with handling all of the sprites and the dynamic characters and also the scrolling and everything else like that. Because this game does have a lot of stuff going on in the background. So let's open the character set view. We can see that there's some character set information there. There's some character set information in the Vic Bank starting at 8,000 as well. But mostly the game uses one character set when it's rendering, but the character set information itself seems to update as the game scrolls along. So pay close attention to the character set. Now I don't have cheat modes turned on, do I? But so this is going to be more difficult. But as I move up the screen, let's go into a tank, trying to play the game and also watch the character set at the same time. But as I scroll up the screen, then we should see eventually, if I don't die too often. Yeah, that's going to be quite difficult. Let's go back to the trained version and turn on invulnerability. So watch around about there for the character set updates. We can see the character set changing, the character set data itself changing as the different intro screens and the title screen sequence come on. Just looking at the data at the beginning of memory, so there seems to be quite a lot of calculation of screen data going into the beginning of memory as well. There seems to be two banks of extra data being calculated into kind of like a virtual screen, which seems to be then copied into the single buffered screen as the game screen scrolls around. But yeah, you can see, look, how much data is decompressed over several frames as the different game screens come on, as the extra graphics based picture logo bounces onto the screen. There we go. We can see actually from this routine here, because of the watch store point in the screen data, we can see that it's doing a partial unrolled copy from top to bottom by the looks of it. So basically it's copying bunches of data from the beginning of memory at 4E0, CE0, and it's storing it into the screen and the color RAM spaces in memory. Okay. My cat, if you can hear my cat is also agreeing with that. But yeah, it's copying 0 to 1F, so that is 32 characters. So here we are, pay close attention to this area in the character set. So as I scroll along for the game, and I'm not dying now because I've got invulnerability mode switched on. Yes, hello cat. Can you hear my cat in the background? She really doesn't like it when I don't pay close attention to her all the time. Anyway, so, yes I know. As I scroll up the screen, we should see the character set data change. There we go, the character set data just changed. And I think that's because the game is going to start rendering this face. Kind of like the static gun emplacement, right? So this game uses nice dynamic character-based updates to introduce new graphics, like just in time. Kind of like a little bit like Flying Shark did. But notice here, look, the gun emplacement there updates the characters just there where my mouse pointer is. So you can see as I move left and right, the gun emplacement character-based animation also updates in the character set as well. So the game is making nice use of basically player-responsive dynamic character-based updates for the object map animations in the background, as well as obviously updating the dynamic characters for the player bullets and also the enemy bullets as well. You can see that being used there in the character set information on the screen. We saw that in the C64 debug GUI, but it's a little bit easier, I think, to see in the graphics map view there in ICU64. As I continue moving up the screen, we should see more dynamic character-based updates. I mean, there were dynamic character updates for the rope bridge graphics coming along, but now as I scroll up the screen, we go into this transition area, and then we get new character-based updates for this like end of level area coming along, and then if I keep on scrolling up the screen as quickly as possible, we should see a whole bunch of new characters come in for the next part of the level graphics. I'm trying to play and also watch at the same time. I need 4 sets of eyes, I think. Maybe one eye to the left and one eye to the right. How about that? There we go. More graphics coming in now. More dynamic character updates. Probably for these rock formations, right? Or the plant leaves or the grass or whatever. That thing as well was, I think, a new set of character-based graphics. So I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted to go over in this game. We looked at Sprite Multiplexer, how the game uses a lot of dynamic character-based effects for its update. We can see all of the sprites there in the sprite sheet. I didn't see any dynamic sprite updates. But yeah, a really very good conversion, a technically accomplished conversion. I really enjoyed this game. So yes, if you like these kind of technical deep dive videos, then please do consider liking or subscribing to this channel, or sending me a super thanks. They are always very much appreciated. Take care, have a great day, evening or night, wherever you are.